Some crimes are shocking because of their brutality, some because of their mystery. But then there are cases that divide the world into two camps: those convinced of guilt and those forever haunted by doubt. Few modern true crime stories fit that description more than the case of Scott Peterson. In December 2002, Laci Peterson, 8 months pregnant with her first child, vanished from her home in Modesto, California. Overnight, her face was everywhere, on news broadcasts, posters, and front pages. She was radiant, glowing with the promise of new life. Her disappearance gripped the nation and turned into one of the most heavily covered missing persons cases in American history. At the center of it all stood her husband, Scott. Tall, clean-cut, and outwardly calm. To some, he seemed stoic, focused on finding his wife. To others, he seemed distant, cold, even suspicious. And when it was revealed that he was having an affair, the media narrative snapped into place. Scott Peterson was not the perfect husband. He was a liar. And if he could lie about that, what else could he hide? The case became a spectacle, fueled by live updates, endless analysis, and a public desperate for answers. But when Scott was finally arrested and convicted of murdering his wife and unborn son, the debates didn't end. They only grew louder. Because unlike many murder trials, this one was built almost entirely on circumstantial evidence. No murder weapon, no eyewitness, no forensic smoking gun, just motive, opportunity, lies, and suspicion. Was Scott Peterson truly guilty of killing his wife, or was he convicted because of how he looked, how he acted, and how the media portrayed him? Was he the perfect husband hiding the perfect lie, or was he a man swallowed whole by a perfect storm of perception? In this documentary, we'll walk through the full timeline of events, the evidence presented at trial, the overwhelming media frenzy, and the enduring debates that continue to this day. Because the story of Scott Peterson isn't just about one man, one woman, or one crime. It's about the way we judge guilt, the way the media shapes our truth, and the uneasy question that still lingers nearly 2 decades later. Did we get it right? If you're new here, don't forget to subscribe to Dark Truths, True Crime Stories. This is where we peel back the layers of the most haunting and debated cases of our time. And if you'd like to support the channel even more, consider joining as a member. Members can request topics, help shape future episodes, and ensure that stories like these continue to be told. Now, let's begin with the timeline of a marriage that looked picture perfect, until Christmas Eve 2002 changed everything. The timeline of events. Scott and Laci Peterson's story began like something out of a romance novel. The kind of story people told with smiles on their faces. They met in the mid-1990s at California Polytechnic State University in San Luis Obispo, a sunlit college town along the California coast. Scott was studying agricultural business, a clean-cut, ambitious young man from a middle-class family. Laci Rocha was a bubbly horticulture major, known for her energy, her warmth, and her ability to make friends wherever she went. When their paths crossed, it felt like destiny. Laci later told friends that she made the first move. She walked into the restaurant where Scott worked and left her phone number for him, saying she was interested. From the very beginning, she was drawn to his charm, his confidence, his looks. And for Scott, Laci represented everything bright and beautiful about the future. Their relationship blossomed quickly, the way young love often does, full of laughter, long talks, and dreams of the life they would one day build together. By 1997, they were married. Family and friends celebrated what looked like a perfect match. Scott's ambition balanced Laci's warmth. He had big plans for his career, and she envisioned a life centered around family. They moved to Modesto, California, where they bought a small, cozy home. It wasn't extravagant, but it was theirs, and they filled it with love, plans, and the little rituals that make up married life. To neighbors, they looked like the couple everyone admired. Laci was often seen tending to her garden, walking her golden retriever, Mackenzie, or hosting gatherings. She was the kind of person who seemed to brighten every room she entered. Scott, though quieter, appeared steady, polite, and hardworking. On the outside, they were the American dream. A young couple, a new house, a future filled with promise. By 2002, the couple's life was about to change forever. Laci was 8 months pregnant with their first child, a boy they planned to name Connor. She embraced pregnancy with enthusiasm, decorating a nursery in cheerful colors, buying baby clothes, and talking endlessly about becoming a mother. Friends said she glowed with excitement, often resting her hands on her belly as she talked about Connor's future. For her, motherhood was the fulfillment of everything she had ever wanted. Scott, outwardly, seemed to play the role of a supportive husband. He attended doctor appointments, posed for photos with Laci, and made plans for their expanding family. But beneath the surface, Scott's life was not as picture-perfect as it seemed. In November 2002, he began an affair with a Fresno woman named Amber Fry. To Amber, Scott presented himself as single, telling her he was unattached and ready for a relationship. Within weeks, he escalated the lie, telling Amber he was a widower, that he had lost his wife, and that this would be his first Christmas without her. The date he said this was December 9th, 2002, 2 weeks before Laci vanished. That single revelation, words spoken quietly over the phone, would later hang over the entire case like a dark cloud. Because when Laci disappeared and the world searched for her, Scott had already told another woman that his wife was gone. December 24th, 2002, was supposed to be an ordinary holiday morning. Laci had plans: bake cookies, run errands, prepare for the family gathering later that night. She was 8 months pregnant and moving slowly, but she was full of energy and anticipation. That morning, Scott told police he had decided to go fishing at the Berkeley Marina, about 90 miles away from Modesto. He said he left around 9:30 a.m., planning to spend a few hours on the water before returning home. When he arrived back that afternoon, Laci was gone. The house was empty, but her car was in the driveway. Inside, her keys, wallet, and phone were untouched. Their golden retriever, Mackenzie, was later found wandering the neighborhood with his leash still attached, as if he had been taken for a walk but returned alone. By evening, her stepfather, Ron Gransky, reported her missing. That night, the Modesto Police Department began their search. The disappearance of a pregnant woman on Christmas Eve was immediately unusual, immediately alarming. It wasn't like Laci to vanish. She was responsible, grounded, and always in contact with family. Her mother, Sharon Rocha, instantly knew something was wrong. And the timing, so close to Christmas, with gifts under the tree and a baby on the way, made the situation even more heartbreaking. The next morning, the case hit the local news. By the end of the week, it was national. Photos of Laci filled television screens across America. The young woman with dark hair and a wide smile, cradling her belly, radiating maternal joy. She wasn't just a missing person anymore. She was the face of a national tragedy. The search effort was massive. Volunteers poured into Modesto, distributing thousands of flyers. Helicopters scanned fields and waterways. Police divers searched canals. The Berkeley Marina quickly became a focus because of Scott's fishing trip. From the very beginning, investigators were suspicious. It was unusual, they thought, for a man to go fishing alone on Christmas Eve when his pregnant wife needed him at home. But at that moment, suspicion was not evidence. All they had was a missing woman and a husband whose story didn't sit right. But then came the press conferences. And this is where public opinion began to turn. When Sharon Rocha stood before cameras, her voice cracked with grief, begging for her daughter's safe return. Laci's stepfather broke down in tears, his anguish raw and unfiltered. And then Scott appeared. He was calm, too calm. He spoke evenly, almost rehearsed, without the visible desperation people expected from a man whose wife and unborn child were missing. To many, his demeanor wasn't composure, it was coldness. In those early days, the difference between the Rocha family's visible grief and Scott's flat tone created a divide. The public began to ask, why isn't he crying? Why isn't he begging? Why doesn't he look devastated? It didn't matter that grief takes different forms, that not everyone processes trauma the same way. On television, under the harsh lights of cameras, Scott looked like the wrong kind of husband. And then came January 2003. Amber Fry stepped forward, revealing not only that she had been romantically involved with Scott, but that he had lied to her about his marital status. More shocking, she revealed recordings of phone calls in which Scott said he was a widower, that this Christmas would be his first without his wife. But Laci was very much alive when he said those words. For investigators, Amber was a gift. For the public, she was proof. Scott wasn't just unfaithful. He was deceptive. He wasn't just distant. He was living a double life. If he could lie about his wife being dead before she was missing, wasn't that the clearest sign of guilt? The affair shifted the case from a tragedy to a scandal. By February, Scott wasn't just Laci's husband. He was the prime suspect in her disappearance. The affair with Amber Fry didn't just change the case. It changed the entire way the public saw Scott Peterson. Up until that point, there had been doubt, confusion, and whispers of suspicion, but there was still room for sympathy. After Amber's revelation, that sympathy vanished. Overnight, Scott became the villain in a story that had already captured the hearts of millions. He wasn't just the husband of a missing woman anymore. He was the man who lied to another woman, who pretended to be widowed while his pregnant wife was still alive, who lived two lives with chilling ease that Amber's decision to cooperate with police proved crucial. Detectives fitted her with recording equipment, capturing hours of phone calls between her and Scott in the weeks following Laci's disappearance. On those tapes, Scott continued to weave his lies. He spoke about traveling overseas, about missing Laci, about confusion and sorrow. To some listeners, the calls revealed a manipulator, calm, polished, skilled at spinning stories. To others, they revealed a man trying desperately to maintain control of a crumbling double life. Either way, the damage was done. The public wasn't just suspicious anymore. They were furious. Meanwhile, the search for Laci continued. Every day that passed without answers deepened the heartbreak. Candlelight vigils were held. Flyers papered cities across California. Police combed through the Berkeley Marina again and again, dragging nets through the water, searching for any sign of her. Hundreds of volunteers joined in, moved not only by compassion, but also by the feeling that this story belonged to all of them. Laci had become America's missing daughter, but as weeks turned into months, the strain on her family was overwhelming. Sharon Rocha gave interviews pleading for anyone with information to come forward. She described her daughter as joyful, loving, and excited to be a mother. She spoke about Connor, the baby who should have been born in February 2003, and how the family had already bought clothes and toys for him. Every word was a reminder of what had been lost, and every tear she shed deepened the contrast with Scott's composed, almost indifferent demeanor. The Rocha family began to openly suspect Scott. In their eyes, he wasn't just unhelpful, he was evasive. He seemed more concerned with avoiding attention than finding his wife. He didn't show up at search efforts. He dodged questions, and behind the scenes, he continued to call Amber, telling her stories that painted himself as a man adrift in grief. Even as he dodged the painful reality playing out around him. By March 2003, police were under immense pressure to solve the case. The media circus showed no sign of slowing down. Every development was broadcast in real time. Every rumor became a headline. And still, there was no body, no forensic evidence, no direct proof. All they had was a trail of lies, a suspicious fishing trip, and a husband who didn't seem to behave like a grieving husband should. And then, in April, the story took its darkest turn. On April 13th, a couple walking their dog along the San Francisco Bay shoreline stumbled upon the body of a small fetus, badly decomposed but still identifiable as a late-term pregnancy. The next day, less than a mile away, another body washed ashore. This time, it was an adult woman. Though the remains were badly deteriorated, investigators knew instantly who they were. DNA testing later confirmed the grim truth. The fetus was Connor Peterson, and the woman was his mother, Laci. The location was no coincidence. It was less than 2 miles from the very marina where Scott said he had been fishing the morning Laci disappeared. For police, it felt like the final piece of the puzzle. For the public, it was the confirmation of what they had already believed for months. On April 18th, just days after the bodies were discovered, police moved in to arrest Scott Peterson. He was tracked to a golf course parking lot in La Jolla, near San Diego, hundreds of miles from Modesto. The details of his arrest became as famous as the crime itself. He was found with nearly $15,000 in cash, multiple cell phones, a water purification system, survival gear, and his brother's identification card. His hair and beard had been bleached lighter, giving him a different appearance to investigators. It looked like a man preparing to flee. To Scott's defense attorneys, it was simply a case of paranoia. They argued that Scott was staying near his family in San Diego, that the cash was from selling his truck, that the hair was the result of sun exposure, not disguise. But in the court of public opinion, the image was seared into memory. Scott Peterson, found with cash, disguises, and gear, just days after his wife and son's bodies were discovered. The arrest marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. Now, the case would move into the courtroom, where the evidence would be tested, where jurors would decide his fate, and where the debates that still rage today would first take root. But even before the trial began, one truth was clear. The media had already convicted him. The headlines screamed guilty, and the public was eager for justice. Whether the evidence would match the perception was another matter entirely. Scott Peterson's trial would not just be about facts, it would be about images, impressions, and the power of storytelling in a world where television defined truth. The arrest of Scott Peterson in April 2003 marked a turning point. For months, the public had speculated, debated, and scrutinized every word he said, every movement he made. Now, he would face the one judgment that mattered most, a jury of his peers. The trial, which began in June 2004 in Redwood City after a change of venue due to intense media coverage, quickly became one of the most watched courtroom dramas in modern American history. From the outset, the courtroom atmosphere was electric. Television crews camped outside daily, and journalists filled every seat inside, live blogging and reporting updates to millions. Outside, protesters and supporters shouted, waved signs, and demanded justice for Laci and baby Connor. It was the O.J. Simpson trial for a new generation, a mix of tragedy, scandal, and spectacle. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Rick DeStaso, painted a chilling narrative. Scott, they argued, was a man living a double life. On one side, the perfect husband with the perfect home and a child on the way. On the other, a man lying to his mistress, telling her he was free of responsibility and fantasizing about a new life. They claimed he killed Laci in their home sometime on the night of December 23rd or early on December 24th, loaded her body into his truck, and dumped her into the San Francisco Bay during his fishing trip. His motive, they said, was simple: freedom. Freedom from fatherhood, freedom from responsibility, freedom to pursue life as a single man with Amber Fry.to drive this home. The prosecution leaned heavily on the recorded phone calls between Scott and Amber. The jury listened to hours of conversations in which Scott spoke not as a grieving husband searching for his wife, but as a man whispering to his lover, assuring her of his devotion. In one call, made on New Year's Eve while a vigil for Laci was taking place, Scott told Amber he was in Paris, watching fireworks over the Eiffel Tower. In reality, he was just miles from Modesto, at a vigil for the woman he claimed to love. For prosecutors, this wasn't just deception. It was cruelty. It was proof of his indifference, his selfishness, his double life. Amber herself took the stand, testifying with calm honesty about her relationship with Scott and the lies he had told her. Her presence was powerful. She was not vengeful. She was straightforward, and her credibility made Scott's lies impossible to ignore. In many ways, Amber became the star witness, not because she saw a crime, but because she revealed the character of the man accused. The physical evidence, however, was thin. There was no murder weapon, no eyewitnesses, no blood trail. The state could not even pinpoint exactly how Laci had been killed. Their case was built almost entirely on circumstantial evidence: Scott's fishing alibi, the location where the bodies were found, his lies to Amber, his suspicious behavior, and the items found at his arrest. The defense, led by attorney Mark Garagos, seized on this weakness. They argued that the prosecution's case was speculation stacked on suspicion. Without direct evidence, how could anyone be certain of guilt? They suggested that Laci may have been abducted while walking the dog, pointing to reports of burglaries in the neighborhood around the same time. They highlighted the fact that no one saw Scott harm Laci, no one saw him transport a body, and no forensic evidence tied him to her death. Garagos hammered the point again and again. Infidelity is not murder. For months, the trial seesawed between these two narratives. The prosecution framed Scott as a calculating killer who saw his wife and unborn child as obstacles. The defense framed him as an ordinary man with flaws. Yes, a cheater, Yes. A liar, but not a murderer. The jury deliberated for 7 days in November 2004. The world held its breath, waiting for the verdict. When it came, it was decisive. Scott Peterson was found guilty of first-degree murder for the death of Laci Peterson and second-degree murder for the death of baby Connor. The courtroom erupted. Outside, cheers broke out among crowds who had followed the case for nearly 2 years. To them, justice had been served, but the story didn't end there. The trial moved into a penalty phase, where jurors had to decide whether Scott would receive life in prison or the death penalty. Prosecutors pushed for death, arguing that the killing of a pregnant woman and her unborn child demanded the harshest punishment. They pointed again to Scott's lies, his callousness, and his attempt to start a new life with Amber while his wife was missing. On December 13, 2004, the jury recommended death. 1 month later, Scott Peterson was formally sentenced to die by lethal injection at San Quentin State Prison. For many, the image of him standing in court, expressionless as the sentence was read, was the final confirmation of everything they believed about him. Cold, detached, guilty, and yet, even as the verdict was celebrated by millions, debates began almost immediately. Legal experts questioned whether the circumstantial evidence was enough. Commentators wondered how much the media coverage had influenced the jury. Some argued that Scott was condemned not just for what he did, but for how he appeared, his calmness, his lies, his lack of visible grief. The Peterson case was over, but the Peterson controversy had only just begun. The media storm: how perception shaped public opinion. The disappearance of Laci Peterson didn't just trigger a criminal investigation. It triggered a media storm unlike almost anything seen before. From the very beginning, this case wasn't just about facts. It was about images, emotions, and the way millions of people interpreted what they saw through the lens of television and print. In the early 2000s, the 24-hour news cycle was in full swing, and the Peterson case became its perfect fuel. To understand why, you have to picture the world in December 2002. The country was glued to cable news. Stories like the O.J. Simpson trial in the 1990s had already shown networks that crime could drive ratings like nothing else. And here was a story that checked every box. A beautiful, 8 months pregnant woman vanishing on Christmas Eve. A young couple living the suburban dream. A family desperate for answers. It was tragic, relatable, and cinematic. The networks couldn't resist. From the first day, television coverage focused on contrast. On one hand, Laci was portrayed as the perfect wife and expectant mother. Photos of her smiling, her hand resting on her round belly, filled screens night after night. Reporters highlighted her kindness, her excitement for motherhood, her close bond with her family. She wasn't just a missing woman anymore. She was a symbol. America felt like it knew her, like it had a stake in her return. On the other hand was Scott. He was clean-cut, polite, but distant. At press conferences, he didn't cry. He didn't shout. He didn't beg the way people expected. While Sharon Roche's voice cracked with grief, while Ron Gransky wept openly for his stepdaughter, Scott stood calmly, speaking in measured tones. To some, that looked like composure. To most, it looked like coldness. And on television, where emotion is everything, coldness reads as guilt. The contrast became the story. Every broadcast was edited to reinforce it. The tearful Rocha family on one side, the stone-faced Scott Peterson on the other. The public was given a narrative before investigators had even collected half the evidence. And once a narrative takes root, it's hard to shake. Then came January 2003, when Amber Frey stepped into the spotlight. If the story had already been captivating, Amber turned it into a sensation. She revealed not only that she had been romantically involved with Scott, but also that he had lied to her, telling her he was single, even widowed, while Laci was still alive. The press devoured it. Headlines screamed double life, husband's secret affair, the other woman. Tabloids plastered Amber's face beside Laci's, creating a storyline ripped from soap operas. The pregnant wife and the mistress. Amber didn't stop at a press conference. She cooperated with police, recording hours of conversations with Scott after Laci's disappearance. In those calls, Scott wove lies with astonishing ease. He told Amber he was in Europe, that he was grieving, that he longed for her. Meanwhile, vigils were being held for Laci and Modesto. To the media, the contradiction was irresistible. How could a man be flirting with his mistress while his pregnant wife was missing? The implication was obvious. He wasn't grieving because he already knew she was never coming back from that moment forward. The story wasn't just about finding Laci, it was about condemning Scott. And television made sure the condemnation was constant. The revelation of Amber Frey's existence changed everything. Up until then, Scott Peterson had been a husband under suspicion. But once Amber told her story, he became a national villain. To the media, the case no longer needed nuance. It had a clear storyline now. The radiant pregnant wife, the deceitful husband, and the unsuspecting mistress caught in the middle. It was a narrative that practically wrote itself, and television networks were eager to broadcast every chapter. Amber's press conference in early January 2003 was watched by millions. Standing before the cameras, she looked nervous, fragile, yet determined. She explained how she had met Scott, how he had told her he was single, how he had claimed his wife had died. Her voice cracked as she admitted she had believed him. In that moment, she wasn't just a witness. She was a character in a drama. The mistress betrayed, the woman who had been living in ignorance while the nation searched for Laci. The public rallied around her almost instantly. She was forgiven for being the other woman because she too was a victim of Scott's lies. The media latched onto this angle, and Amber became a regular presence on nightly broadcasts. Commentators analyzed her statements, speculated on her feelings, and even praised her courage for coming forward. But beneath the praise was a constant drumbeat. If Scott could lie so convincingly to Amber, what else could he lie about? If he could say he was a widower 2 weeks before Laci disappeared, didn't that make him a killer? Scott's taped phone calls to Amber became some of the most played and replayed audio of the year. News programs broadcast them in prime time, with pundits dissecting every word. When Scott told Amber on New Year's Eve that he was in Paris watching fireworks, while in reality he was attending a vigil for his missing wife, the hypocrisy was unbearable to watch. To viewers, it wasn't just suspicious. It was evil. It was proof that he didn't care about Laci, that he was living in an alternate reality where only his own desires mattered. Tabloid headlines grew bolder. The perfect lie, one read, next to a smiling photo of Scott and Laci on their wedding day. Another splashed the words "murderer husband" across the cover before a jury had even been selected. Talk shows like Larry King Live and Nancy Grace invited experts to analyze his behavior. Was Scott a sociopath? Did his lack of tears mean he had no conscience? Night after night, the speculation became more extreme. It wasn't just a search for truth anymore. It was entertainment. The Rocha family, meanwhile, became fixtures in the media as well. Sharon Rocha's grief was raw and unfiltered. Every time she spoke, the public's sympathy for Laci deepened, and by extension, their anger towards Scott intensified. Viewers didn't just see this as a crime. They saw it as a betrayal of family, of trust, of the very idea of marriage and fatherhood. In America's living rooms, Scott Peterson wasn't just a man under suspicion. He was a monster hiding in plain sight. It'd be why the time Scott was arrested in April 2003, just days after the bodies of Laci and Connor were discovered, the public had already reached its verdict. He was guilty. The cash, the disguises, the bleached hair, those details cemented what millions already believed. Even before a single juror was sworn in, Scott's fate had been sealed in the minds of the public. This is what legal scholars call trial by media. It happens when the press doesn't just report on a case, but actively shapes the story in a way that creates pressure on jurors, judges, and prosecutors. And in Scott Peterson's case, it was perhaps one of the most extreme examples of the era. The O.J. Simpson trial had shown the power of cameras inside the courtroom. The Peterson case showed the power of cameras outside of it, shaping every perception before the trial even began. By the time Scott Peterson walked into a courtroom in 2004, he wasn't just another defendant facing trial. He was already one of the most infamous men in America. Television cameras hadn't followed him inside. California law prevented the trial from being televised, but they didn't need to. The trial was already playing out in the headlines, on nightly talk shows, and in the living rooms of millions of Americans. This environment created enormous challenges for jury selection. Out of more than 1,000 potential jurors, many admitted they had already formed opinions. How could they not? For over a year, every newspaper, every news program, every tabloid had painted Scott as guilty. His face had been splashed across covers with words like monster, liar, murderer. Even when reporters tried to be neutral, the very act of showing Laci's glowing pregnancy photo beside Scott's flat, stone-faced mug reinforced the narrative. Potential jurors came into the courtroom already primed to see Scott not as a man presumed innocent, but as the villain from their television screens. The prosecution knew this worked in their favor. They leaned heavily on the very elements the media had already magnified: Scott's lies to Amber, his calmness, his inconsistencies. They replayed the recordings of him talking to Amber, not just because they contained evidence of deceit, but because those recordings carried the same emotional punch that had outraged the public months earlier. The jury didn't just hear Scott's words. They heard them through the echo chamber of everything they had already seen and read. The defense fought an uphill battle. They argued again and again that Scott was being convicted in the court of public opinion, not on the facts. They pointed out that there was no direct evidence tying him to Laci's death, no blood in the house, no weapon, no eyewitness. They tried to frame him as a flawed man, guilty of infidelity and lies, but not of murder. Yet, for every point they made, there were months of headlines, months of nightly speculation, and months of public anger stacked against them. Legal experts later compared Scott's trial to other infamous cases where media coverage shaped outcomes. The O.J. Simpson trial in the mid-1990s had shown how cameras in the courtroom could turn a trial into theater. The Casey Anthony case years later would show how overwhelming media outrage could linger even after an acquittal. The Peterson case sat somewhere in between. The cameras weren't inside, but the circus outside was just as powerful. Jurors might not have been watching Nancy Grace every night, but their families, their friends, their coworkers were. The cultural weight of the case was impossible to escape, and the effect of this media environment lingered long after the verdict. When Scott was sentenced to death in December 2004, millions celebrated. For them, it wasn't just about justice for Laci and Connor. It was about closure to a story they had followed every night for 2 years. But for others, doubt crept in. They asked, had the media shaped this case too much? Had Scott been convicted for being a bad husband rather than for being a murderer? Had the narrative been so overwhelming that no jury could have reached any other conclusion? These questions are why the Scott Peterson case still divides people today. On one hand, the evidence, though circumstantial, was strong enough to convince 12 jurors beyond a reasonable doubt. On the other hand, the media storm was so relentless that it is almost impossible to imagine a truly fair trial. Even the California Supreme Court acknowledged problems in 2020 when it overturned Scott's death sentence, citing errors in jury selection. His conviction still stands, but the shadow of the media's influence lingers. The Peterson case became a cautionary tale for how news coverage can shape justice. It showed how the press, in its hunger for ratings, could build a narrative so powerful that it becomes the truth, regardless of what the evidence says. And it revealed something unsettling about the public, too, that sometimes we don't want a slow, careful weighing of facts. We want a story, a villain, a resolution. And in Scott Peterson, the media gave us all three, yet even after 2 decades, the debates rage on. Was Scott truly guilty, or was he destroyed by the perfect storm of media coverage and public perception? Was he the perfect husband hiding the perfect lie, or was he a man condemned not for murder, but for cheating, lying, and failing to look the part of a grieving spouse? These are the questions that keep the case alive in documentaries, books, and conversations to this day, because the Peterson case isn't just about one man or one crime. It's about us, the way we consume stories, the way we judge people from the outside, and the way truth can be shaped not just by evidence, but by perception. The evidence versus the doubts. When the trial of Scott Peterson began, one thing became immediately clear. This was not going to be a case solved by a smoking gun. There was no DNA trail pointing to Scott, no weapon with his fingerprints, no eyewitness placing him at the scene of a murder. This was not a case built on the hard science of forensics. It was a case built on behavior, on lies, on circumstantial connections. And that made it both compelling and controversial. The The prosecution opened with a simple theory. Scott Peterson killed his wife in their Modesto home on the night of December 23rd or in the early hours of Christmas Eve. They argued that he then transported her body to the Berkeley Marina, where he launched his small aluminum boat and disposed of her in the bay. They couldn't prove exactly how he killed her, whether by strangulation, suffocation, or another method, but they didn't need to. Their case was that he had both motive and opportunity, and that the discovery of Laci and Connor's bodies near the marina where Scott claimed to have been fishing was no coincidence. The evidence they presented fell into several categories. The first was Scott's lies, particularly to Amber Frey. Those phone calls, those recorded words where he described himself as a widower before his wife even disappeared, painted him as a man already rehearsing life without Laci. His affair, the prosecutors argued, wasn't just a fling. It was a motive. He wanted freedom from the responsibilities of marriage and fatherhood so he could pursue a new life. The second category was his behavior. Jurors heard how Scott appeared calm and detached when Laci first went missing. They listened to recordings of him talking to Amber about vacations and romance, while vigils for his wife were happening back in Modesto. They learned that while Laci's family was consumed with grief, Scott was consumed with maintaining his lies. To the prosecution, this wasn't the behavior of a grieving husband. It was the behavior of a guilty man. The third category was circumstantial evidence tied to the Berkeley Marina. Investigators searched Scott's small boat and found traces of cement dust and evidence that he had made homemade anchors. Though only one anchor was recovered, prosecutors suggested he had made several and used them to weigh down Laci's body. They also presented evidence of his fishing trip, receipts showing he had launched at the marina, cell phone records placing him in the area, and witness statements confirming his presence. Then came the most damning detail of all. In April 2003, when Laci and Connor's bodies were discovered, they washed ashore less than 2 miles from where Scott said he had been fishing that morning. The prosecution argued that this was not chance. It was proof that he had dumped them there. On the surface, the prosecution's case was powerful. Motive, opportunity, and bodies found near his fishing spot. Lies that made him look like he had been preparing for Laci's disappearance before it even happened. Behavior that didn't match what people expected. All of it wove together into a story that convinced jurors, but beneath that story lay the doubts. And the defense made sure to highlight them. Mark Garagos, Scott's lead attorney, hammered away at the lack of direct evidence. He pointed out that no one saw Scott kill Laci. No one saw him transport a body. No forensic evidence, no blood, no hair, no fibers tied Laci's death to Scott's truck or his home. The homemade anchors? Speculation, he argued. They couldn't prove more than one had ever been made, and they couldn't prove any anchor had been used to weigh down a body. The marina connection? Coincidence, Garagos said. The bay was massive, and bodies can drift miles from where they were originally placed. There was no way to prove Scott was the one who put them there. The defense also introduced alternative theories. They pointed to reports of burglaries in the neighborhood around the time Laci disappeared. They suggested she may have been abducted while walking the dog, a theory consistent with the fact that Mackenzie had been found wandering the street with his leash still attached. If she had stumbled across burglars or other criminals, wasn't it possible that someone else had taken her? The lack of a body for months, Garagos argued, left plenty of room for doubt. Perhaps the most powerful argument the defense made was this: Scott Peterson was on trial for being a bad husband, not for murder. His affair with Amber Frey, his lies, his calm demeanor, all of that made him look like a villain. But infidelity, they reminded the jury, is not proof of homicide. Coldness is not proof of killing. Lies are not proof of murder. And yet, despite these arguments, the jury found Scott guilty. Why? For many observers, the answer lies not in the strength of the evidence, but in the power of the story. Prosecutors gave jurors a simple, compelling narrative. He didn't want to be a husband or a father, so he killed his wife, an unborn child. It was neat, it was clear, and it aligned perfectly with the image the media had built of him for months. The defense's theories, while plausible, were messy, uncertain, and incomplete. In a battle of stories, the cleaner one often wins. Even today, legal experts debate the fairness of that verdict. Some argue the circumstantial evidence was overwhelming and the jury got it right. Others insist it was a conviction built on perception, not proof. And the questions remain. Should a man be sentenced to death when no one knows exactly how, when, or where the murder happened? Should lies and infidelity outweigh the lack of hard evidence? Did Scott Peterson kill his wife, or was he convicted for failing to look like the grieving husband people wanted him to be? These questions are why the case endures. They are why, even decades later, documentaries and podcasts revisit it, lawyers file appeals, and the public remains divided. Because at the heart of the Peterson trial was not just evidence, it was doubt. And doubt, once planted, never really goes away. The heart of the prosecution's case against Scott Peterson was not what they could prove, but what they could suggest. They didn't have to show the jury a weapon. They didn't have to provide blood evidence or fingerprints. Instead, they needed to build a chain of circumstances so convincing that it became impossible to imagine anyone else being responsible. And that's exactly what they tried to do. One of the most striking pieces of circumstantial evidence was Scott's fishing alibi. On the morning of December 24th, he claimed to have gone fishing at the Berkeley Marina. At first glance, that doesn't sound suspicious. People fish all the time. But the timing and the location raised eyebrows. Why? Prosecutors asked, would a man leave his 8 months pregnant wife home alone on Christmas Eve to go fishing, a hobby he barely engaged in? Why drive 90 miles away on a holiday morning? And why, of all places, the Bay, a place that, for months later, would give up the bodies of his wife and unborn child? The defense argued back with logic. Scott had receipts showing he was at the marina. He had no reason to lie about his whereabouts, because he told police about his trip from the very beginning. If he had dumped a body in the Bay, why point investigators there himself? But the prosecution's version was cleaner, more sinister. He mentioned the marina early to create an alibi, never expecting the bodies to resurface. Another major piece of the prosecution's case was the condition of the bodies when they were found. Laci's remains were badly decomposed, missing limbs, and largely skeletal. Connor's body, however, was more intact, with the umbilical cord still attached. Forensic experts testified that the fetus had likely been expelled from Laci's body due to decomposition, not because he was born alive. But to jurors, the image of mother and child washing ashore separately was haunting. It suggested not only death, but deliberate disposal. And the fact that they were found near the marina where Scott had been fishing seemed, to many, too coincidental to ignore. Still, the defense pushed back hard. They reminded the jury that the San Francisco Bay is vast and unpredictable. Currents carry bodies and debris for miles. To assume the place where the bodies washed ashore was the same place they had been dumped was to ignore the complexities of tides and winds. Garagos argued that anyone could have placed the bodies in the bay, and their eventual resting place did not point uniquely to Scott. It pointed only to the fact that the bay is a body of water where tragic things can end up. Then there were the homemade cement anchors. Investigators found traces of cement dust at Scott's warehouse, where he kept his boat. They found one cement anchor, crudely made, and theorized that he had made more and used them to weigh Laci's body down. But here too, the evidence was incomplete. They never found the supposed additional anchors. They never found conclusive proof that the anchor had been used in connection with Laci's remains. It was an inference, a suggestion, not hard fact. The defense seized on this, painting it as a prime example of the prosecution's weakness. If Scott had really made several anchors, where were they? If he had used them to sink a body, why wasn't any trace recovered? A single anchor did not make him a murderer, they argued. It made him a man who fished. And fishing, inconvenient as it was on Christmas Eve, was not a crime. The prosecution also leaned heavily on Scott's demeanor. They showed jurors his taped phone calls with Amber, contrasting his smooth lies with the anguish of the Rocha family. They described how he sold Laci's car, tried to sell their home, and seemed ready to move on even while search efforts were underway. To the jury, this painted a man devoid of empathy, eager to erase his old life. But here again, the defense raised a point that still resonates in debates today. Demeanor is not evidence. People grieve differently. Some cry openly, some withdraw, some appear calm. To judge a man guilty of murder because he didn't act the way the public expected was to confuse personality with proof. Experts who followed the case were divided. Some believed the circumstantial evidence was overwhelming, that when all the threads were woven together, they formed a rope that tied Scott Peterson to the crime. Others argued that the case was dangerously thin, that it relied too much on inferences and the public's distaste for Scott's character. After all, they pointed out, how many men have cheated on their wives, lied about their relationships, or behaved selfishly during times of crisis? Infidelity and dishonesty are not admirable, but neither are they capital crimes. And yet, when those flaws were combined with the image of Laci's smiling face, her rounded belly, and the tiny body of Connor, they became more than flaws. They became motive. The jurors weren't just weighing evidence. They were weighing stories. The story of a man trapped in a marriage he didn't want, versus the story of a devoted wife and mother-to-be whose life was cruelly stolen. It's here that the question of doubt comes into focus. In the American justice system, the standard is beyond a reasonable doubt. But what is reasonable? For some jurors, the coincidences, the lies, the marina, the anchors, and the behavior were enough to erase all doubt. For others watching from outside, the gaps, the lack of a weapon, the lack of forensics, the reliance on demeanor, left room for uncertainty. This tension is what makes the Peterson case endure. Because unlike trials where overwhelming forensic evidence seals the story, this one left open spaces. And in those spaces, doubt has lived for 20 years. When the jury finally received the case in November 2004, they carried with them months of testimony, exhibits, and arguments. But what they really carried were stories. The prosecution's story was simple. Scott Peterson wanted out. He was tired of his marriage, tired of the responsibility of fatherhood, and infatuated with the freedom promised by Amber Fry. So he killed his wife and unborn son, disguised his actions with a fishing trip, and tried to erase the life he no longer wanted. The defense's story was equally clear. Scott was a liar, yes, and a cheater, yes, but not a murderer. The state had no direct evidence, only suspicions, and in a case this serious, suspicion should never be enough. The jurors deliberated for 7 days. In those deliberations, according to later reports, the lies loomed large. Jurors said they could not get past the fact that Scott told Amber he was a widower before Laci was even gone. To them, that wasn't just dishonesty. It was foreknowledge. It was the behavior of a man rehearsing his life after the crime. His taped calls, where he spoke casually about Paris and fireworks while vigils were being held for Laci, sealed the impression that he was indifferent at best, guilty at worst. The marina was another sticking point. The coincidence felt too strong. Of all the places in California Scott could have gone fishing, he went to the exact bay where his wife and son's bodies were later found. The defense could argue currents and coincidences all day, but the image was seared into the jury's minds. Scott at the marina, and months later, Laci and Connor in the water nearby. That visual connection, though circumstantial, carried enormous weight. And then there was demeanor. Jurors admitted that Scott's calmness, his lack of visible grief, worked against him. In a trial shaped as much by perception as by fact, how he appeared in court, how he spoke, how he failed to break down, all of it mattered. People want to see contrition, sorrow, humanity. Scott seemed to show none. Whether it was his natural personality or a mask of guilt, the effect was the same. It made it easier to believe the worst about him. When the guilty verdict was read, the courtroom erupted in emotion. Laci's family sobbed, holding each other. Outside, crowds cheered. For the public, this was justice. For the jury, it was the resolution of a story that had been building for nearly 2 years. And when they later recommended the death penalty, they said it was because of the cruelty of the crime. Not only the murder of a young woman, but also of her unborn child. But the doubts didn't die with the verdict. In the years that followed, legal experts, journalists, and advocacy groups dissected the case. Some argued that the jury had been swayed by emotion and media coverage rather than facts. Others insisted the circumstantial evidence was overwhelming. The debates intensified in 2020 when the California Supreme Court overturned Scott's death sentence, ruling that jury selection had been flawed. While his conviction remained, the decision reignited questions about fairness on appeal. Scott's lawyers argued that the trial had been poisoned by pretrial publicity and that key evidence had been misrepresented. They claimed investigators had ignored other leads, such as the possibility of a burglary in the neighborhood on the day Laci vanished. They pointed out inconsistencies in witness statements and weaknesses in the forensic analysis. and they argued that the sheer weight of media coverage had made it impossible for Scott to receive a fair trial. Supporters of Scott's innocence highlight several key doubts. First, the timeline. The prosecution never proved exactly when or how Laci was killed. Without that anchor, they say, the entire case floats on assumptions. Second, the lack of forensics. In most murder cases, there is some trace, blood, fibers, DNA, that ties the suspect to the crime. Here, there was none. Third, the alternative theories. Could Laci have confronted burglars? Could someone else have targeted her? These questions remain unanswered. Critics of the verdict also note how much weight was placed on Scott's character rather than his actions. He was convicted not only for killing Laci, but for failing to act like the grieving husband people wanted him to be. His lies, his affair, his flat affect, all damning in the eyes of the public, but not, in themselves, proof of murder. To some, this case represents the danger of letting perception outweigh evidence. And yet, for every person who insists Scott's conviction was unfair, there are many more who believe the jury got it right. They point to the totality of the circumstances, the lies, the marina, the anchors, the arrest with cash and disguises. They argue that while no single piece of evidence was conclusive, together they formed a picture of guilt too strong to ignore. For them, the absence of direct forensics doesn't erase the overwhelming circumstantial case. This tension between evidence and doubt, between perception and proof, is why the Scott Peterson case continues to fascinate. It is not a closed story, tidy and complete. It is an open wound, a reminder of how justice can be clear to some and murky to others. For some, it is the story of a man who killed his wife and child to chase a fantasy. For others, it is the story of a man destroyed by lies, infidelity, and a media that turned him into a villain before he ever stood trial. And so the question lingers, was Scott Peterson guilty because of what he did, or because of who he was perceived to be? Was it the evidence, or the doubts ignored, that sealed his fate? These are the questions that echo long after the gavel fell, the questions that keep the case alive in books, documentaries, and debates nearly 2 decades later. The trial aftermath and appeals. When Scott Peterson was sentenced to death in December 2004, the moment felt like the climax of a story the world had been watching for 2 years. The courtroom was packed, reporters filled every corner, and outside, crowds waited to hear the decision. When the words "death penalty" were read aloud, cheers erupted in the streets. To many, it was justice delivered. The perfect husband, revealed to be the perfect liar, would pay the ultimate price. For Laci's family, the sentence brought a measure of closure. Sharon Rocha wept as she thanked the jury, saying that although nothing could bring her daughter and grandson back, at least there was accountability. Ron Grant Ski, who had raised Laci as his own, echoed that sentiment. For them, the trial was never about media narratives or legal theories. It was about the woman they had lost. But for Scott, the sentence marked the beginning of another chapter, life on death row at San Quentin State Prison. There, he joined more than 700 inmates awaiting execution, confined to a cell for 23 hours a day. Photos from those early years show him with closely cropped hair, wearing the standard orange jumpsuit, a far cry from the clean-cut man the public had once seen smiling in family photos. Even as he adjusted to prison life, Scott's legal team began preparing appeals. In California, a death sentence automatically triggers an appeal to the state's Supreme Court. For years, his lawyers filed motions, arguing that errors had been made in jury selection, that evidence had been misrepresented, and that the overwhelming media coverage had made a fair trial impossible. Meanwhile, the case remained in the public consciousness. Books were written, documentaries aired, and true crime shows revisited the trial again and again. The narrative rarely changed. Scott was guilty, cold, and calculating. But in smaller circles, legal forums, innocence projects, and among certain journalists, questions lingered. Could it be that the jury had been swayed more by perception than fact? As the years passed, Scott's life at San Quentin became routine. He worked small prison jobs, maintained correspondence with family, and lived in the shadow of the execution chamber. Though California had not carried out an execution since 2006, His appeals moved slowly through the courts, each one raising the same core issues: pretrial publicity, jury bias, and the lack of direct evidence. For most of the public, these efforts went unnoticed. Scott was out of sight, out of mind. But in 2020, nearly 2 decades after Laci's disappearance, the California Supreme Court issued a stunning ruling. While they upheld Scott's conviction for the murders of Laci and Connor, they overturned his death sentence. The reason wasn't evidence, it was procedure. The court found that the trial judge had improperly dismissed jurors during the selection process, excluding anyone who simply voiced opposition to the death penalty, even if they could have set aside their personal beliefs and followed the law. This, the justices ruled, was unconstitutional. The ruling reignited the Peterson debate. For Scott's supporters, it was a glimmer of hope, a sign that maybe the case had deeper flaws than the public realized. For his critics, it was a technicality, one that didn't change the fundamental truth of his guilt. The state announced it would not seek a new death penalty trial, meaning Scott's sentence would be commuted to life in prison without parole. He would live, but he would never be free. Even after this decision, Scott's legal battles continued. His attorneys filed petitions for a new trial, arguing that a biased juror, who had failed to disclose her own history of domestic violence, tainted the verdict. In 2022, a judge reviewed the claims but ultimately ruled against him, stating that while the juror had erred in her disclosures, there was no evidence she had acted with bias during deliberations. Scott's conviction stood. The aftermath of the trial has been a story in itself, one that reflects the enduring power of the case. For the Rocha family, the appeals process has been a painful reminder of their loss. Each hearing, each filing, forces them to relive the tragedy. For the public, the case has become a touchstone in debates about circumstantial evidence, the influence of media, and the fairness of the death penalty. And for Scott Peterson, it has been a life defined by waiting for appeals, waiting for decisions, waiting for a system that moves painfully slow. He has now spent more years behind bars than he did as a free man married to Laci. His name, once synonymous with suburban normalcy, is now forever tied to one of the most notorious cases in American history. The verdict and death sentence didn't just end a trial. It extended the life of the case in ways few could have predicted. In December 2004, when Scott Peterson was led from the courtroom in shackles, television cameras captured every step. The footage played on repeat. The man once seen smiling beside his pregnant wife now branded forever as a murderer. For days, the story dominated every front page and every nightly broadcast. And while the Rocha family clung to the relief that justice had been served, the media machine was far from done. The Peterson case had been ratings gold. Networks had built entire segments around it for nearly 2 years, and they weren't going to let the story fade quietly. In the months after the trial, documentaries aired recapping every detail. Talk shows brought in jurors to give exclusive interviews. Tabloids ran inside prison stories about Scott's adjustment to San Quentin, even though most of those stories were speculative at best. He became, in effect, a permanent character in America's true crime canon. One of the strongest threads in post-trial coverage was the question of motive. Why had Scott killed Laci? Prosecutors argued it was because he wanted freedom. Commentators added their own theories, that he was a narcissist, that he resented the impending responsibility of fatherhood, that he was obsessed with control. These interpretations gave the media fresh angles to explore, turning Scott into a psychological case study as much as a convicted murderer. But alongside the dominant narrative of guilt, a smaller, quieter countercurrent of doubt began to emerge. Legal analysts pointed out that the trial had been overwhelmingly circumstantial. Books appeared with provocative titles suggesting Scott may have been railroaded by a biased jury. Innocence Project advocates began to cite the case as an example of how media pressure can overwhelm due process. These voices were few compared to the chorus of guilty verdict supporters, but they kept the embers of debate alive. Meanwhile, Scott's life inside San Quentin became a subject of fascination. Reporters described death row as a world unto itself, with its own rhythms and culture. Scott was housed in a small cell, allowed limited recreation, and surrounded by hundreds of other men condemned to die. He spent much of his time reading, writing, and corresponding with family. Stories circulated about women writing him love letters, proposing marriage, and treating him as a misunderstood figure. This phenomenon, known as hybristophilia, the attraction some people feel toward men convicted of violent crimes, only added to the bizarre mythology that surrounded him. Every few years, the case would flare back into headlines. In 2012, when the 10th anniversary of Laci's disappearance arrived, media outlets ran retrospectives, interviewing investigators, family members, and legal experts. Each time, the same images resurfaced: Laci's bright smile, Scott's blank stare, Amber Frey's press conference. They had become part of America's collective memory. The rise of true crime media in the 2010s gave the Peterson case a new life. Podcasts dedicated entire seasons to re-examining the evidence. Documentaries on streaming platforms dissected the trial, raising questions about whether Scott was truly guilty or the victim of a media-driven witch hunt. The narrative began to fracture. While most Americans still saw him as guilty, a growing number started to question whether the justice system had worked as cleanly as it seemed. This renewed interest came to a head in 2020, when the California Supreme Court overturned Scott's death sentence. The decision was procedural, not based on innocence, but it was enough to put the case back in the spotlight. News outlets dusted off old footage, re-interviewed jurors, and once again debated the central question: was Scott Peterson guilty because of evidence or because of perception? For the Rocha family, these revivals were exhausting. Each appeal, each documentary, each article was a reopening of wounds. Sharon Rocha wrote a book about her daughter's life and death, trying to reclaim Laci's story from the endless media circus. She described the pain of seeing her daughter turned into a headline, her grief turned into public entertainment. For Sharon, the case wasn't about doubt or appeals. It was about the simple, devastating truth that her daughter and grandson were gone. But for the public, doubt is addictive. The idea that a man could be sentenced to death with no direct forensic evidence struck a chord. People began to split into camps: those who believed the jury got it right, and those who believed Scott had been convicted for being a cheater and a liar, not a killer. True crime forums lit up with debates. Amateur sleuths pored over transcripts, evidence lists, and trial footage, each one convinced they had found the missing piece of truth. And so, even after years behind bars, Scott Peterson remained a household name. He was not just a prisoner. He was a symbol. To some, he symbolized justice, the proof that killers could not hide behind charm and lies. To others, he symbolized the flaws in America's justice system, a man condemned more by emotion than by evidence. This dual legacy is what keeps the case alive, long after most trials have faded from memory. Scott Peterson is not just an inmate at San Quentin. He is a story we tell ourselves about guilt, innocence, and the power of perception. And in that sense, the trial aftermath has never really ended. The California Supreme Court's 2020 ruling overturning Scott Peterson's death sentence shocked many who thought the case had long been settled. For nearly 2 decades, Scott had lived under the shadow of execution at San Quentin, a symbol of justice for Laci and Connor. But the court's decision changed everything, not because they questioned his guilt, but because they found errors in how his jury had been selected. At the heart of the ruling was the trial judge's handling of jurors during selection. California law requires that potential jurors who oppose the death penalty but can still follow the law must be considered eligible. In Scott's case, however, the judge dismissed dozens of such jurors outright. The Supreme Court ruled that this violated his constitutional rights. As a result, Scott's death sentence was vacated. His conviction remained, but he would no longer face execution. This ruling reopened wounds for the Rocha family. Sharon Rocha publicly expressed her pain and frustration, saying that while she respected the court's decision, the idea of revisiting the case, even partially, was re-traumatizing. For her, nothing had changed. Her daughter and grandson were still gone, and Scott was still guilty. The legal technicalities didn't alter the devastating reality of her loss. For Scott's supporters, however, the ruling was a crack in the wall. They argued it showed that his trial had been flawed from the start, shaped by bias and error. If the death penalty had been imposed unfairly, could the conviction itself also be tainted? These questions gave momentum to his legal team, who quickly filed petitions seeking a full retrial. Central to these petitions was the controversy surrounding one juror, Rochelle Nice. During jury selection, Nice had failed to disclose that she had once been involved in a domestic violence case and had sought a restraining order while pregnant. Defense attorneys argued that this made her biased, particularly in a case involving a pregnant victim. If she had disclosed her past, they said, she would have been dismissed. Instead, she became one of the jurors who voted to convict Scott and sentence him to death. In 2022, a San Mateo County judge reviewed the claims in an evidentiary hearing. Scott's attorneys argued that Nice had concealed her history and entered the jury box with a personal bias against Scott. Prosecutors countered that her omission was a mistake, not malice, and that her conduct during the trial showed no evidence of prejudice. After months of review, the judge ruled against Scott, finding no proof that the jurors' actions had compromised the fairness of the trial. His conviction stood once again. In December 2021, before the juror ruling, Scott was officially resentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He was transferred off death row but remained incarcerated in California. For many, this was the final closure. He would never walk free again. For others, it was another unsatisfying chapter in a case that seemed to raise more questions than it answered. Even now, the Peterson case continues to divide opinion. Documentaries released in the last few years have reignited debates, with some viewers convinced all over again of Scott's guilt, while others walk away with doubts. Podcasts dedicated to re-examining evidence attract millions of listeners, each one eager to weigh the arguments for themselves. The case has become more than a trial. It has become a cultural mirror, reflecting the way we wrestle with truth, justice, and doubt. Public opinion remains split. Polls and online discussions show that a majority still believe Scott is guilty. For them, the motive, the lies, and the Marina connection remain too powerful to ignore. But a significant minority has grown louder, insisting that the case was built on perception, not proof. They argue that Scott's conviction says as much about America's appetite for a villain as it does about his guilt. The enduring fascination with this case lies in its uncertainty. With many high-profile trials, the evidence is overwhelming and the verdict, once reached, silences debate. But with Scott Peterson, the opposite is true. The lack of a clear murder weapon, the absence of direct forensics, the reliance on demeanor, all of these leave cracks in the narrative. And in those cracks, doubt takes root and grows. For Laci's family, however, there is no debate. They remain steadfast in their belief that Scott is guilty, that justice was served in 2004, and that every appeal is an attempt to distract from the truth. For them, the only story that matters is the one of a daughter stolen, a grandson lost, and a family forever shattered. For Scott, life now stretches endlessly behind prison walls. He has traded the finality of death row for the monotony of life without parole. He will never walk the streets again, never taste freedom, never live outside the shadow of the crime that defined him. Whether guilty or innocent, his life has been swallowed whole by the events of December 2002. And for the rest of us, the Peterson case remains an unsolved argument in our collective conscience. Did we get it right? Or did we allow perception, media, and bias to decide what evidence could not? These questions may never be fully resolved, which is why, 2 decades later, we are still telling this story, still debating, still searching for the truth in a case that refuses to let go. The enduring debates. Nearly 2 decades after Laci Peterson's disappearance, her husband's arrest, and his conviction, the case continues to provoke arguments that seem almost endless. For many people, Scott Peterson's guilt is obvious. They point to his lies, his affair, his demeanor, and the haunting coincidence of Laci and Connor's remains washing up near the marina where Scott went fishing. For them, the jury's verdict was correct and justice was served. But for others, the case represents something darker, the possibility of wrongful conviction, of a man condemned not because of solid evidence, but because of public outrage, media pressure, and his own failings as a husband. This divide has created one of the most enduring debates in true crime history. And the reason it endures is because the case sits at the uncomfortable intersection of law, perception, and human behavior. On one side are those who believe the circumstantial evidence was overwhelming. After all, How many lies can one man tell before those lies add up to guilt? How many coincidences can surround one person before they stop looking like coincidences? Scott told his mistress he was a widower before his wife vanished. He went fishing at the very bay where her body was later found. He made homemade anchors that prosecutors argued were used to weigh her down. He sold her car, tried to sell their house, and flirted with a new life even as vigils were held for his missing wife. To those convinced of his guilt, these details form a rope braided of lies and selfishness, strong enough to hang him even without direct forensic proof. That on the other side are those who argue that justice requires more than suspicion. They remind us that the standard in American law is beyond a reasonable doubt. And doubt, they say, runs through the Peterson case like cracks in glass. There was no murder weapon, no eyewitness, no blood, no DNA linking Scott to Laci's death. The prosecution couldn't even establish a clear cause of death. To critics, this wasn't a case proven beyond doubt. It was a case decided by anger at a man who cheated, lied, and didn't cry on camera. They argue that Scott may be guilty of being a terrible husband, but being a terrible husband is not the same as being a murderer. This tension is what makes the case endure. Unlike others where the evidence leaves little room for debate, here the evidence is largely circumstantial, leaving just enough space for doubt to thrive. And doubt is powerful. It makes people argue. It makes them dig through transcripts. It makes them return again and again to the question, did we get it right? One of the strongest threads in the enduring debate around Scott Peterson is the role of the media. From the very beginning, the case wasn't just about evidence. It was about images, headlines, and sound bites. The smiling photos of Laci with her pregnant belly became the defining image of innocence lost, while the stiff, expressionless face of Scott became the picture of guilt. For 2 years, this contrast was broadcast into millions of homes, shaping public opinion long before the trial began. Critics argue that the media effectively convicted Scott before the jury did. His calm demeanor at press conferences was interpreted as coldness. His decision to go fishing on Christmas Eve was portrayed as sinister. His affair with Amber Fry became the ultimate proof of motive. Every action was filtered through the assumption of guilt. Even neutral facts, like the dog being found with its leash, or Scott's warehouse receipts, were twisted into suspicious details once the media narrative was set. This phenomenon, often called trial by media, isn't unique to Scott Peterson. The O.J. Simpson case in the 1990s showed how saturation coverage could turn a criminal trial into a cultural event, with commentators dissecting every piece of evidence as if it were theater. But Scott's case revealed a slightly different danger. The way media can create a narrative so strong that it overshadows the actual evidence presented in court. By the time jurors were selected, many admitted they already believed he was guilty. Could they ever have been impartial after 2 years of relentless coverage? That question still hangs over the case. Comparisons to other cases highlight this problem. In the Casey Anthony trial, the media portrayed her as a heartless party girl who cared more about nightclubs than her missing daughter. When she was acquitted, public outrage exploded because the story the media had built didn't match the jury's verdict. In O.J.'s trial, the defense managed to flip the narrative, painting police misconduct as the central theme, and the media amplified that too. In both cases, the coverage shaped expectations in ways that went beyond evidence. That Scott's case sits between these examples. The jury's verdict matched the public narrative. He was guilty, but that match is precisely what fuels doubt today. Did the jury truly reach its conclusion based on the evidence alone? Or were they influenced, consciously or unconsciously, by the media storm that had already declared Scott a monster? Even the smallest details became ammunition in this media-driven trial by perception. When Scott sold Laci's car, commentators said it showed he was erasing her. When he tried to sell their house, it was portrayed as proof he wanted a new life. When he dyed his hair and carried cash at his arrest, it was broadcast as a clear attempt to flee justice. Each detail, taken on its own, may have been explainable, but in the media's telling, they stacked up like bricks in a wall, closing in around him. And once the wall was built, it was nearly impossible to see beyond it. The endurance of the Scott Peterson case speaks to something bigger than one man or one crime. It speaks to the tension between what we feel and what we can prove, between justice as a legal process and justice as a story told in the public square. And in the Peterson case, those two versions of justice collided in a way that still leaves people unsettled. For many Americans, the case became a test of how much circumstantial evidence should matter. Prosecutors reminded jurors that circumstantial evidence is still evidence, and that when enough of it points in one direction, it can be just as powerful as forensics or eyewitnesses. Supporters of the verdict often argue that life is rarely neat, that killers don't always leave behind fingerprints or confessions, and that to demand smoking gun evidence in every case would allow too many guilty people to walk free. To them, Scott's lies, his behavior, and the discovery of the bodies near his fishing spot add up to a truth too obvious to ignore. But others push back, pointing out that the same web of circumstances that can look convincing can also be misleading. Lies can make a person look guilty, but people lie for many reasons: fear, shame, self-preservation. Affairs can make someone unlikable, but infidelity is not murder. Odd behavior during grief can be explained by personality, not necessarily by guilt. Critics argue that if we allow perception to outweigh proof, we open the door to wrongful convictions, where someone can be condemned for being unlikable, unfaithful, or unusual, rather than for what they actually did. This debate touches something primal in human nature: our need for stories. As humans, we want clear villains and heroes, motives and resolutions. The media understood this instinctively, framing Laci as the perfect wife and Scott as the perfect liar. That narrative was satisfying. It gave viewers someone to root for, someone to hate, and a conclusion that tied it all together. But real life is rarely so tidy, and the fact that Scott's trial leaned so heavily on perception raises questions about whether the story we told ourselves about him was too simple. The Peterson case also became a mirror reflecting our expectations of marriage, fatherhood, and grief. Much of the outrage toward Scott stemmed not from direct evidence, but from the belief that he failed at the role of husband. He didn't cry enough. He didn't act devastated. He cheated. He seemed ready to move on. In the public imagination, a real husband would have been inconsolable, visibly shattered, begging for his wife's return. Scott wasn't, and so people concluded he must have been guilty. This reveals how much of our justice system, even if unconsciously, relies on human expectations, not just hard proof. Comparisons to other cases highlight this dynamic. In Chris Watts's case, the evidence was overwhelming: confessions, video footage, bodies recovered from his workplace. Few doubts remain about his guilt. In Casey Anthony's case, the jury acquitted her because the evidence didn't meet the standard of proof. But the public still judged her guilty, in part because she didn't act like the grieving mother people expected. In O.J. Simpson's case, the evidence seemed strong, but the defense's story and the context of racial tension overpowered it, leading to an acquittal that shocked the nation. Each of these cases shows how perception, story, and emotion shape outcomes as much as evidence does. Scott Peterson's case sits uneasily among them. The jury found him guilty, but the evidence left room for doubt. The media told a story so powerful that it may have overwhelmed nuance, and the public remains split, even now. That division is what keeps the Peterson case alive in books, documentaries, podcasts, and debates. Because it's not just about Scott and Laci. It's about us. It's about how we consume stories of crime and punishment, how we judge people based on appearances, how we weigh the balance between doubt and certainty. It forces us to ask, would I have voted guilty if I had been on that jury? Would I have been swayed by the tears of Laci's family, by the tapes of Scott whispering lies to Amber, by the haunting coincidence of the bodies near the marina? Or would I have demanded more, hard evidence, direct proof, before sending a man to death row? These are not easy questions. They go to the very heart of what justice means. Is justice about truth or about closure? Is it about proof beyond doubt, or proof beyond what feels reasonable? In Scott Peterson's case, the answers are murky, and that murkiness is why we are still talking about it 2 decades later. The enduring debates around this case show no sign of fading. As long as there are people who believe Scott was wrongly convicted, there will be petitions, appeals, and arguments. As long as there are people who believe he got exactly what he deserved, there will be fierce defenses of the verdict. And as long as there are storytellers, journalists, authors, podcasters, filmmakers, there will be new retellings of the case, each one trying to answer the question that refuses to die. Was Scott Peterson the perfect husband hiding the perfect lie, or a man destroyed by perception and circumstance? In the end, the Peterson case may never give us the certainty we crave. But perhaps that's the point. Perhaps its legacy is to remind us that justice is not always clear, that guilt and innocence can be clouded by stories and expectations, and that sometimes, even after the verdict is read, the real trial continues in the court of public opinion, where the debates never end. Psychological portraits. To understand why the Scott Peterson case continues to resonate so deeply, it isn't enough to talk about timelines, evidence, or verdicts. The power of this story lies in the people at its center, the psychological portraits that emerged during and after the trial. Because at the heart of every true crime case, what fascinates us most isn't just what happened, it's why it happened, and who the people were behind the headlines. Let's start with Scott Peterson himself. The man who went from suburban husband to one of the most hated figures in America seemingly overnight. To those who believe he is guilty, Scott embodies traits of narcissism and sociopathy. They point to his lies, slick, effortless, often unnecessary, as signs of a man who manipulates without remorse. His calm demeanor in the face of tragedy is interpreted as emotional detachment, the mark of someone incapable of empathy. In this reading, Scott is the archetype of the family annihilator light, not someone who murdered in a burst of rage, but someone who coldly calculated, removed obstacles from his life, and pursued his own desires at any cost. Psychologists analyzing his behavior during the trial often pointed to his ability to compartmentalize. On the one hand, he could sit with Amber Fry on the phone, spinning elaborate tales about trips to Paris and life as a widower. On the other, he could attend vigils for his missing wife, standing silently beside her grieving family, giving nothing away. This ability to maintain two realities at once suggests a personality that thrives on control and deception. For many, it was this duplicity, not a piece of forensic evidence, that convinced them of his guilt, but others see Scott differently. To those who argue his innocence, his calmness is not sociopathy, but personality. Some people simply don't display emotion the way others expect. Some retreat inward in times of crisis, maintaining a stoic exterior. They argue that to label him a narcissist or sociopath because he didn't cry publicly is to confuse demeanor with diagnosis. In this portrait, Scott isn't a monster. He's a man with flaws, an adulterer, a liar, but not necessarily a killer. Then there is Laci Peterson, whose image became central to the case from day one. Laci wasn't just a missing woman. She was portrayed as the perfect wife, the glowing mother-to-be, the embodiment of innocence and family values. Friends and family described her as warm, outgoing, and endlessly enthusiastic about life. She loved entertaining, gardening, decorating, and above all, she loved the idea of becoming a mother. Psychologically, Laci's portrait mattered because it magnified the contrast with Scott. The more perfect she appeared, the more monstrous he seemed. But some critics argue that this perfect wife image, while powerful, was also part of the media's simplification. Laci was human, like anyone else. She had her ups and downs, her frustrations, her complexities. By elevating her to sainthood, the media unintentionally fed into the demonization of Scott, creating a black and white story that may not have reflected reality. Still, in the public imagination, Laci remains forever frozen in those smiling photos, forever the innocent victim. Amber Frey's psychological portrait is equally fascinating. Thrust into the spotlight as the mistress, she could have been vilified. In many cases, the other woman is painted as complicit or opportunistic. But Amber's calm, open, and consistent testimony reframed her as a secondary victim. She, too, had been deceived by Scott's lies. She, too, had been manipulated into believing a fantasy. Psychologically, Amber became the foil to Scott. Where he lied, she told the truth. Where he manipulated, she cooperated. Where he hid, she exposed. This made her credible, even sympathetic, and her testimony became a cornerstone of the prosecution's case. And finally, there is the Rocha family, the psychological portrait of grief, resilience, and anger. Sharon Rocha, in particular, emerged as one of the most powerful figures in the story. Her raw emotion, her pleas for Laci's safe return, her tears in the courtroom, all of these humanized the tragedy. Psychologists note that families like the Rochas often become stand-ins for the public's own feelings. Viewers projected their anger, sorrow, and need for justice onto Sharon, making her both a grieving mother and a symbol of moral clarity. These psychological portraits, Scott the liar, Laci the perfect wife, Amber the truth-teller, Sharon the grieving mother, became the architecture of the story. They shaped how people interpreted the evidence, how jurors reached their verdict, and how the case is remembered. They also show why the debates never end. Because when we discuss Scott Peterson, we aren't just debating facts. We're debating what kind of man he was, what kind of woman Laci was, and what kind of story this tragedy tells about human nature itself. Scott Peterson's psychology has been the subject of endless speculation. To his detractors, his lies, his infidelity, and his calmness in the face of tragedy all point to a narcissistic personality, someone focused on self-preservation, incapable of true empathy, and always calculating his next move. Narcissists, psychologists say, often maintain a charming public facade while hiding darker impulses. For many, Scott fit that pattern too neatly. Outwardly, he was the clean-cut husband, running a small business, preparing for fatherhood. Privately, he was juggling an affair, spinning elaborate lies to Amber Fry, and seemingly indifferent to his wife's disappearance. The ability to compartmentalize so completely, whispering sweet nothings to Amber, while the world searched for Laci, suggests a mind comfortable with deception. It wasn't just that Scott lied. It was how smoothly he lied. He created entire false realities, telling Amber he was in Europe, describing fireworks over the Eiffel Tower while he was, in fact, standing at a vigil for his missing wife. That kind of fabrication, some argue, reveals a deep psychological detachment from truth, but others push back, arguing that to pathologize Scott too easily is dangerous. Calmness, they say, doesn't equal narcissism. People react to grief in radically different ways. Some collapse publicly, others internalize their pain. Some become highly emotional, others cling to routine or even denial. Scott's flat effect could just as easily reflect his personality or upbringing as it could guilt. To assume that lack of tears equals murder is, in their view, an oversimplification of human psychology. Meanwhile, Laci's psychological portrait became almost mythic. From the moment she was reported missing, her family and the media painted her as the perfect wife and mother-to-be. She loved holidays, she decorated enthusiastically, she cooked for friends and family, she embraced pregnancy with joy. Psychologists note that in high-profile cases, victims often become symbols rather than people. Laci wasn't just Laci. She became America's daughter, America's mother-to-be. That symbolic role magnified the contrast with Scott. The more radiant and idealized Laci appeared, the darker Scott looked in comparison. This contrast mattered enormously. Trials are as much about narrative as they are about fact, and Laci's image became a central part of the story. Her smiling photographs, shown nightly on television, made her a symbol of innocence. Scott's lack of visible grief, juxtaposed against those photos, made him appear monstrous. In psychological terms, Laci became the archetypal victim, while Scott became the archetypal villain. It was a narrative so powerful that it shaped how jurors and the public interpreted every piece of evidence. Amber Frey's psychological journey is equally fascinating. Thrust into the glare of cameras, she could have been vilified as the mistress. Instead, she became the unexpected heroine of the case. Initially, she was simply a woman deceived, someone who believed Scott when he said he was single, who trusted his words, who thought she was entering an honest relationship. But once she learned the truth, she didn't retreat. She cooperated with police, wore a wire, and testified in court. This transformation, from unwitting mistress to key witness, gave her psychological portrait depth. She was nervous, vulnerable, even embarrassed at first. But over time, she grew into the role of truth-teller, standing in contrast to Scott's lies. Psychologists have noted that Amber displayed resilience under extraordinary pressure. She faced the glare of the media, the judgment of the public, and the weight of knowing her testimony could help decide a man's fate. And yet, she held firm. That steadiness made her credible, not just as a witness, but as a person. For the Rocha family, the psychology of grief played out in public. Sharon Rocha's heartbreak was visible in every press conference, every interview, every courtroom appearance. Her pain was raw, and it connected with people on a deep level. In her, viewers saw not just a grieving mother, but the embodiment of parental love and loss. Psychologists often note that in cases like this, the family becomes a vessel for collective grief. Sharon's tears weren't just her own, they were America's. Her pleas for justice carried not just her voice, but the voice of millions who wanted closure. Together, these psychological portraits created a narrative architecture that shaped the entire case. Scott as the liar, Laci as the angelic victim, Amber as the brave truth-teller, Sharon as the grieving mother. Once these portraits solidified in the public imagination, they became hard to challenge. Every new fact, every new argument, was filtered through them. And that, more than any single piece of evidence, is why the case became what it did. After the verdict, psychologists, criminologists, and commentators continued to dissect Scott Peterson's psychology. Why would a man with a seemingly stable life, a beautiful wife, and a child on the way risk it all? For those convinced of his guilt, the answer lay in personality. Scott was portrayed as narcissistic, driven by his own desires, incapable of empathy, willing to discard people when they no longer suited him. His affair with Amber wasn't just a betrayal. It was interpreted as a window into his psyche, a sign that he saw relationships as transactional, a stage to perform on rather than a commitment to uphold. Some experts suggested he displayed traits of sociopathy. The coolness, the ability to lie without hesitation, the double life, these were classic markers of antisocial tendencies. A sociopath, they argued, could compartmentalize so completely that lying about being a widower while his wife was still alive wasn't just possible, but natural. In this view, Scott wasn't merely selfish. He was fundamentally detached from the emotional realities of others, but not everyone agreed. Other psychologists cautioned against armchair diagnoses. They noted that humans are quick to label unusual behavior as pathology, especially when a crime has been committed. Was Scott's calmness sociopathy, or was it simply his way of coping with stress? Was his detachment proof of murder, or just a reflection of a personality that didn't show emotion the way people expected? These questions remain at the center of debates about his guilt. Meanwhile, the psychological portrait of Laci continued to grow in symbolic power. In death, she became more than a person. She became an archetype, the radiant young mother, full of life and promise, cut down before her time. In psychological terms, she became the ideal victim, innocent, sympathetic, deeply relatable. That image fueled outrage at Scott and magnified the public's demand for justice. It also explains why the case still grips people today. Laci represents everything people fear losing: family, safety, innocence, and trust. Amber Frey's psychological arc didn't end with the trial either. She became a public figure, releasing a memoir, giving interviews, and living under the weight of her association with the case. Psychologists note that Amber demonstrated resilience, transforming a humiliating personal betrayal into a role that gave her agency. Instead of being remembered only as the mistress, she became remembered as the woman who stood up, told the truth, and helped bring justice. Still, the psychological toll was immense. She endured public scrutiny, judgment, and the lasting shadow of her connection to one of the most infamous cases of the 2000s for the Rocha family. The psychological impact was profound and lifelong. Sharon Rocha's grief was visible, raw, and unfiltered, and it gave the public a human anchor to the case. But grief on that scale also reshapes people permanently. Psychologists describe how families in such high-profile tragedies often experience public grief, where their personal mourning becomes a spectacle. For the Rochas, every press conference, every courtroom appearance, every anniversary forced them to relive the pain. And yet, they endured. Sharon wrote a book, not only to process her loss, but to reclaim her daughter's story from the noise of media and speculation. In her grief, she became a symbol of resilience, channeling unimaginable pain into a voice that demanded justice. Taken together, These psychological portraits explain why the Peterson case still fascinates. Scott embodies the questions we ask about guilt, lies, and human nature. Was he a cold-blooded narcissist, or a man misjudged by demeanor? Laci embodies innocence and loss, a victim whose story was amplified by her radiant humanity. Amber embodies resilience, a secondary victim who refused to be silenced. And Sharon embodies grief transformed into strength, a reminder of the cost of crime on those left behind. These portraits also highlight why the case remains so divisive. They show how much of the trial hinged not just on evidence, but on how people interpreted personalities. Was Scott's calmness sinister or stoic? Was Amber brave or opportunistic? Was the public's idealization of Laci fair to her complexity as a person, or did it flatten her into a symbol? The answers to these questions often depend less on fact than on perception, and perception is subjective. In the end, the psychological legacy of the Peterson case may be more important than the legal one. It reminds us that trials are not just battles of evidence, but battles of stories and personalities. It shows how much we rely on expectations of how people should act, and how harshly we judge those who fail to meet them. And it reveals how, in the absence of certainty, we fill in the gaps with psychology labels like narcissist, sociopath, perfect wife, truth teller, and grieving mother. These portraits, once drawn, are difficult to erase. They continue to shape how we see the case, how we debate it, and why, decades later, we are still compelled to revisit it. Because the truth is, the Scott Peterson case is as much about who these people were, who we believe them to be, as it is about what happened on Christmas Eve 2002. Legacy and lessons. When the jury delivered its verdict in November 2004, many people thought the Scott Peterson story was over. Justice had been served, the villain had been unmasked, and the grieving family could finally have closure. But in truth, the Peterson case was only beginning its second life. Because what happened in that courtroom didn't just decide the fate of one man. It reshaped the way America thinks about crime, media, and justice. The first and most obvious legacy is the way the case cemented true crime as cultural obsession. It arrived at a moment when cable news was expanding, when talk shows needed stories that would hook viewers night after night. The O.J. Simpson trial had proven that crime could drive ratings. The Peterson case proved that you didn't even need cameras inside the courtroom. You just needed compelling characters, a gripping mystery, and endless speculation. Networks discovered that people would tune in for daily updates, even when there was no real news to report. Every press conference, every sighting of Scott, every tear from Sharon Rocha was treated like breaking news. This model became the blueprint for true crime coverage in the 2000s and beyond. Casey Anthony, Jodi Arias, Chris Watts. Each of these cases was shaped not only by what happened in court, but by what happened on television screens and, later, on social media feeds. In that sense, Scott Peterson's trial wasn't just a legal drama. It was the beginning of a new era where crime stories became serialized entertainment, where the line between information and spectacle blurred beyond recognition. But the legacy isn't just about media. It's about evidence. The Peterson case forced people to confront the question, how much circumstantial evidence is enough? Prosecutors reminded jurors that circumstantial evidence is still valid evidence, that if enough threads point in one direction, the pattern becomes clear. And for the jury, it was enough. But for millions watching at home, the lack of direct forensic proof left a bitter taste. Could someone really be sentenced to death without a murder weapon, without DNA, without a clear cause of death? The answer in Scott's case was yes. And that unsettled people in ways that still linger. The case also reshaped public discussions about marriage, fatherhood, and betrayal. At its heart, this was the story of a man who cheated on his pregnant wife, who lied to another woman, who seemed indifferent to the life he had built. For many, that betrayal was almost as shocking as the murder itself. It forced people to confront uncomfortable truths about relationships, how much we really know about the people we love, how easily deception can hide beneath the surface of suburban normalcy. Scott and Laci looked like the perfect couple. They had a cozy home, a baby on the way, smiling photographs on the mantle. And yet, Behind that image was a man leading a double life. The contrast between appearance and reality became one of the case's most enduring lessons. And then there's the lesson about grief, about how we judge it, about how we expect people to act in times of tragedy. Scott didn't cry enough. He didn't beg. He didn't look devastated. And those choices, or perhaps that personality, were used against him. Psychologists warn that this is dangerous, that grief is complex and manifests in countless ways. But in the court of public opinion, appearances matter more than nuance. Scott's failure to meet society's expectations of the grieving husband became part of the case against him. The legacy here is a cautionary one, that we must be careful about equating demeanor with guilt. But perhaps the deepest lesson of the Peterson case is about perception itself. Trials are supposed to be about evidence, but in reality, they are often about stories. The prosecution told a simple, compelling story. Scott wanted freedom, so he killed his wife and child. The defense told a more complicated story. Scott was a liar and a cheater, yes, but not a murderer, and the evidence didn't prove otherwise. The jury chose the simple story, and the public, primed by months of media coverage, did too. This raises an unsettling question. How often do we, as a society, mistake a compelling story for the truth? The Scott Peterson case cannot be separated from the larger history of America's obsession with true crime. It stands alongside cases like O.J. Simpson, Casey Anthony, and Chris Watts not just because of what happened, but because of how the public consumed it. Each case, in its own way, became a mirror reflecting cultural anxieties and media habits of the time. The O.J. Simpson trial in 1995 was the first to reveal the power of television to turn a courtroom into a stage. With cameras broadcasting every testimony, every objection, every verdict, it blurred the line between justice and entertainment. Millions watched not just because they cared about guilt or innocence, but because it had become must-see TV. The Peterson case showed that the same kind of obsession could be built without cameras inside the courtroom. The wall-to-wall coverage outside, the press conferences, the photos, the interviews, created a parallel drama that was just as captivating. It proved that perception could be shaped entirely by what the media chose to show. Casey Anthony's trial in 2011 further highlighted this phenomenon. The media painted her as a heartless party girl, more interested in dancing in clubs than finding her missing daughter. When she was acquitted, the outrage was volcanic, not necessarily because of the evidence, but because the verdict didn't match the story the media had told. In Scott's case, the opposite happened. The verdict aligned with the media's story, which is why it was celebrated. But both cases showed how public opinion, fed by news coverage, can become detached from the legal process itself. The Chris Watts case in 2018 brought the story full circle. Watts, like Scott, was a seemingly ordinary suburban husband with a pregnant wife and children. When he murdered them and tried to cover it up, the parallels to Scott Peterson were immediate. But there was a difference: technology. Police body cams, doorbell cameras, and digital forensics provided overwhelming evidence of Watts's guilt. The public didn't have to rely on circumstantial evidence or demeanor. They could see the lies unravel in real time. The Watts case underscored what the Peterson case lacked: a clear, undeniable forensic trail. And yet, both became cultural touchstones, reminding us that sometimes the perfect husband image is the most dangerous mask of all. Scott Peterson's place in this lineage is unique. He became the face of circumstantial conviction, the man condemned not by DNA or fingerprints, but by perception, behavior, and coincidence. This has left a complicated legacy for public trust and justice. For some, his case is proof that the system works, that juries can piece together a puzzle even without direct evidence. For others, it's a cautionary tale about how easily a person can be condemned when the story around them is too compelling to resist. Trust in the justice system is fragile, and cases like Peterson's test its strength. They force people to ask hard questions. Do we convict people because the evidence demands it, or because the story feels right? Do we trust jurors to rise above media influence, or do we assume they are as human and biased as the rest of us? And when a man is sentenced to death, only to have that sentence overturned years later because of errors in jury selection, what does that say about the fallibility of the system itself? For the true crime community, Scott Peterson became a permanent case study. He is invoked in podcasts, documentaries, and forums as shorthand for debates about circumstantial evidence. His case is used in law schools to teach about media influence and jury bias. He has become less of a person and more of a symbol, a reference point for the dangers of both underestimating circumstantial evidence and overvaluing perception. This cultural embedding ensures that the Peterson case will never fully fade. Like O.J., like Casey Anthony, like Chris Watts, it has become more than a crime. It has become a story that defines an era, a lesson taught and retaught, a debate that refuses to die. The legacy of the Scott Peterson case goes beyond verdicts, appeals, or even the tragic loss of Laci and Connor. Its true legacy lies in how it reshaped the way we think about crime, justice, and storytelling. One of the most enduring lessons is about the danger of simplifying human behavior. Scott's calm demeanor was read by many as proof of guilt, but psychologists remind us that grief does not follow a script. Some people collapse into tears, others bury themselves in distraction, and some appear cold or stoic. When society demands a performance of grief and condemns those who don't meet the standard, we risk mistaking personality for evidence. The Peterson case reminds us to be cautious in how we interpret emotion, or the lack of it, in times of crisis. Another lesson lies in the power of circumstantial evidence. The prosecution built a case without a murder weapon, without blood, without DNA. They relied on lies, behavior, timing, and coincidence. And the jury believed them. For many, this is proof that circumstantial evidence can be enough, that life itself doesn't always leave behind neat forensic trails. But for others, it is unsettling. It suggests that a person can be condemned not because of what can be proven beyond doubt, but because of how their life looks when seen from a certain angle. This debate, what counts as enough evidence, continues to reverberate in legal circles and living rooms alike. The case also changed the role of media in crime. It showed that you don't need a camera in the courtroom to influence perception. The endless press conferences, the carefully chosen photographs, the nightly panels of experts, all of it created a narrative so powerful that it seemed to dictate the outcome. In the years since, this model has been repeated again and again. True crime is no longer just about facts. It's about packaging those facts into a story that people will watch, share, and debate. The Peterson case was one of the first to fully reveal that formula, and its influence is still felt today, on a cultural level. The case exposed our collective fears about marriage and trust. The idea that the man you love, the man you've built a life with, the man who smiles in photographs beside you, could harbor a secret double life. It shook people to their core. It forced society to confront uncomfortable questions. How much do we really know about the people closest to us? How well can we ever know another person? And if even the picture-perfect Petersons could hide darkness behind closed doors, what did that mean for everyone else's marriages? For the Rocha family, the legacy is more personal. They lost a daughter and a grandson. They endured the public spectacle of grief. They watched the man they once welcomed into their family transform into the figure accused of destroying it. For them, the case was never about media or debates. It was about love, loss, and justice. Sharon Rocha's resilience, her refusal to let her daughter's story be defined only by tragedy, remains one of the most powerful testaments to a mother's love. And finally, the Peterson case leaves us with a lesson about truth itself. In the absence of clear evidence, truth becomes something we construct. Jurors constructed it from circumstantial threads. The media constructed it from images and narratives. The public constructed it from emotions and expectations. And decades later, we are still reconstructing it, still debating, still uncertain. That is why the case endures. Because it forces us to confront not just what happened, but how we know what happened. It asks us to question whether we are guided by facts or by stories, by reason or by perception. And it reminds us that in the search for justice, certainty is sometimes impossible, and doubt is always present. Scott Peterson will likely spend the rest of his life behind bars. He will never again walk free, never again return to the suburban life that once seemed so normal. For some, that is justice. For others, it is a miscarriage. But for all of us, it is a story we cannot forget, a story of love, betrayal, tragedy, and perception, a story that has become part of the fabric of American culture. And so the legacy of the Peterson case is not just about a man or a crime. It is about us, about how we see, how we judge, how we tell stories, and how we search for truth in a world where truth is often clouded by doubt. Self-reflection. When we look back at the Scott Peterson case, we're not just looking at a crime or a courtroom drama. We're looking at ourselves, at the stories we choose to believe, at the way we judge people based on appearances, at how easily perception can blur into truth. This case forces us to ask, how many of our opinions are built on fact, and how many are built on the narratives we've absorbed from headlines and television screens? It also makes us reflect on human relationships, the fragile bonds of trust that hold families together. Laci Peterson's story is a reminder that behind every smiling photograph can lie secrets we may never fully understand. Her life, and the life of her unborn son Connor, were stolen. And whether you believe Scott Peterson was rightly convicted or unfairly judged, one truth remains unshakable: a young mother and child are gone, and a family was shattered. That is the tragedy at the heart of this story, the one detail we cannot debate away. And so we must ask ourselves, what lessons do we take forward? Do we become more cautious in how we consume true crime, less quick to condemn or absolve based on emotion alone? Do we demand higher standards of evidence in courtrooms, or do we accept that sometimes circumstantial evidence is the best we will ever get? Do we acknowledge that grief looks different in everyone and resist the urge to equate demeanor with guilt? The Peterson case doesn't give us easy answers, but maybe that's its greatest lesson, that justice is rarely neat and truth is rarely simple. That if you've stayed with me through this deep dive, I encourage you to reflect. Think critically. Ask yourself not only what you believe about Scott Peterson, but why you believe it. Is it the evidence? Is it the narrative? Or is it something more personal, a reaction to betrayal, to lies, to the fear that someone we trust could be living a double life? And before we close, I have one more request. If you found this exploration valuable, if you want more stories told with depth, honesty, and care, please take a moment to subscribe to this channel. Hit the like button, leave a comment, and share your thoughts on this case. Do you believe Scott Peterson is guilty beyond a doubt? Or do you think perception shaped his fate more than proof? Your perspective matters, and your voice keeps these conversations alive. And if you'd like to support the work I'm doing here, consider joining as a channel member. Members can even request topics for future deep dives, helping to shape the stories we explore together. Because in the end, this isn't just about true crime. It's about truth, doubt, and the human search for justice. And that search, like this story, is far from over.